California's Highway 1 is crumbling again, and this time, an entire cliff face is avalanching straight into the Pacific Ocean. Not cracking, not settling, not slowly eroding over decades. Gone. Road, guardrail, and mountain swallowed by the sea in seconds. The kind of collapse that used to happen once in a generation is now happening so often that crews are barely finished rebuilding one section before another one disappears. But here is what the news isn't telling you. This was not a surprise. Not to the scientists, not to the engineers, not to the government agencies who have been watching this coastline with growing alarm for years. Underneath the drama of another road closure and another round of emergency repairs, there is a far bigger story, one that California has been quietly trying to manage without ever fully admitting out loud. Geologists have already mapped 1,500 landslides running along the Big Sur coastline. And right now, those slides are not sitting still. They are accelerating, moving faster this year than at any point on record. Some of them are shifting inches every single month, inching toward the cliff edge, while traffic reports focus on detour routes and repair timelines. And buried deep inside the government's own geological reports is a detail that should stop every single person who has ever driven that road cold. Caltrans, California's own transportation agency, has been rebuilding Highway 1 on terrain that their own engineers formally classified as having the highest landslide susceptibility. They documented the risk. They built the road anyway. They watched it fall. And then they rebuilt it again, over and over, for nearly a century. So the real question here is not when the next section of Highway 1 drops into the ocean. At this point, that is almost inevitable. The real question, the one that geologists are now asking in language they have never used publicly before, is whether 1,500 landslides have already passed the point where anything can stop them. At 9:47 in the morning, a section of California's Highway 1 near Paul's Slide in Big Sur simply ceased to exist. There was no warning, no gradual crumbling, no slow-motion erosion that gave anyone time to react. A mass of rock, soil, and asphalt the size of a city block sheared away from the cliff face and dropped 40 feet into the Pacific Ocean in under 3 seconds. The sound reached the nearest homes before the dust did. Then there was silence, and where the road had been, there was nothing but open sky and the ocean below. Caltrans District 5 activated emergency operations within the hour. Highway 1 closed in both directions, northbound at Ragged Point, southbound at Nacimiento-Ferguson Road, severing the only paved route connecting Big Sur's permanent community to the outside world. For the roughly 1,000 people who call this coastline home, the closure was not an inconvenience. It was an immediate survival equation. Aerial surveys dispatched that afternoon documented the full scale of the failure. Approximately 150,000 cubic yards of material had separated from the slope, cliff face, roadbed, and drainage infrastructure gone together in a single catastrophic event. The debris fan spreading across the ocean surface below was visible from 1 mile offshore. Engineers on the ground described the fresh scar on the cliff face as still actively shedding material, with secondary slides continuing well into the evening hours. The California Office of Emergency Services coordinated with Monterey County Emergency Management as the scope of the isolation became clear. Medical emergency protocols activated immediately. A Coast Guard helicopter at Naval Air Station Point Mugu was placed on standby for potential evacuations. Supply deliveries to Big Sur's inns, ranches, and residences, normally arriving daily by truck along that same road, stopped completely. Caltrans Director Tony Tavares issued a statement describing the closure as open-ended, with no repair timeline until geological assessments confirmed the slope had stabilized. That process, engineers warned privately, could take weeks. The exposed weak layer in the cliff face was still saturated from the most recent atmospheric river sequence. The mountain, in their language, was not done moving. Emergency geologists arriving the following morning found something that extended the alarm well beyond this single collapse. The slide had not occurred in isolation. On both edges of the fresh scar, ground movement sensors installed after the 2017 Mud Creek disaster were registering active displacement. Not historical movement, not residual settling. Ongoing, measurable ground shift in the slopes immediately adjacent to where the road had just fallen. The instruments were telling geologists something the debris field below had already made obvious. What California was watching was not the end of an event. It was the beginning of one. The number that changes everything is not the size of the slide. It is not the cost of the repair. It is not even the length of the closure. The number that changes everything is 1,500. That is how many active landslide zones the United States Geological Survey and the California Geological Survey have formally mapped along the Big Sur coastline. Those are documented, inventoried, and classified failures, not predictions of what might happen, not theoretical hazard zones drawn by cautious bureaucrats, but confirmed, moving, actively unstable sections of cliff and slope that geologists have physically surveyed and recorded. The map exists. It has existed for years. And what it shows is not a coastline with a landslide problem. It is a coastline that is, in geological terms, in a state of progressive systemic failure. What makes the current data alarming is not the inventory itself. It is what the inventory is now showing about pace. Satellite-based interferometric synthetic aperture radar, InSAR imaging, measures ground surface displacement with millimeter-level precision from orbit. The data coming back from the Big Sur coastal range in the past 18 months shows movement rates in multiple slide zones that have no precedent in the observational record. Areas that were moving a fraction of an inch per year are now moving several inches per month. The acceleration is not uniform. It is concentrated in clusters, particularly on north-facing slopes above the highway corridor, exactly where the most recent failure occurred. To understand why this coastline moves the way it does, you have to understand what it is made of. The Santa Lucia Range, rising above Big Sur, is not solid granite. It is largely composed of what geologists call Franciscan melange, a chaotic, broken assemblage of rock types that were scraped off the ocean floor and accreted onto the continent over millions of years. The material is fractured, sheared, and structurally incoherent at depth. Beneath it, layers of decomposed serpentinite and clay-rich fault gouge absorb water and swell. When saturated, those clay layers do not just weaken, they become near frictionless. The entire mass above them loses its grip on the slope and begins to move. Dr. Ramon Aerosmith, a geomorphologist with the United States Geological Survey Landslide Hazards Program, described the current acceleration pattern in terms that left little room for reassurance. The conditions that stabilize these slopes between major wet cycles are no longer reasserting themselves between storms the way historical patterns would predict. The slopes are not recovering. They are ratcheting. 1,500 mapped landslides. Acceleration rates without precedent. A geological foundation that becomes structurally compromised every time it rains. The map has been drawn. What it is describing is a coastline that has already made its decision and is now in the process of carrying it out. The cliffs are not failing because of one storm. They are not failing because of one weak season or one unusually wet winter. What is happening to the Big Sur coastline right now is the result of multiple destructive forces arriving simultaneously, each one damaging the cliff from a different direction, at a different depth, on a different timeline. And for the first time in the observational record, all of them are intensifying at once. Start at the top. When an atmospheric river makes landfall over the California coast, it does not just wet the surface of the slope. It drives water downward through fractures, fissures, and permeable layers until it reaches the clay-rich zones deep in the cliff's interior. That water does not drain quickly. It builds. The technical term is pore water pressure, the force that water exerts outward against the surrounding rock and soil from inside the slope. When pore water pressure rises high enough, it does not crack the cliff. It simply removes the internal friction that was holding everything in place. The slope does not break. It releases. And because atmospheric rivers are now delivering more total moisture in shorter windows than any period in California's recorded weather history, the pressure is building faster and draining slower than the cliff's natural drainage capacity can handle. Then the ocean attacks from below. Wave action at the base of the Big Sur cliffs has been undercutting the cliff face at a documented rate that has accelerated measurably over the past 2 decades. The process is mechanical and relentless. Waves fracture the base rock, remove material, and gradually eliminate the geological support that holds the slope above it in place. Remove enough material from the bottom of a cliff, and the top has nowhere to go but down. Sea surface temperature anomalies in the Northeast Pacific are generating larger, more energetic wave sets than historical averages, meaning the undercutting is happening faster than the models that shaped California's coastal engineering standards ever accounted for. In between, the repeated cycle of extreme saturation, followed by rapid drying, is destroying the internal cohesion of the cliff face season by season. Each wet-dry cycle opens new fractures. Each fracture admits more water in the next storm. The cliff is not just moving, it is disaggregating, breaking down structurally at a microscopic level with each passing year in a process that cannot be reversed once it begins. Dr. Corey Rovzar at the University of California, Santa Cruz has studied coastal geomorphology along the Big Sur corridor for over a decade. He describes the current convergence as a threshold problem. Each individual factor, including saturation, undercutting, and structural degradation, has always been present. What is different now is that all three are operating at maximum intensity, in the same seasons, in the same locations, without the recovery intervals between events that previously allowed the slope some degree of stabilization. The cliff, he says, is no longer getting a chance to heal. Highway 1 was not built despite the geology. It was built through it, over it, and in several places directly on top of formations that engineers surveying the route in the 1930s flagged in their own field reports as fundamentally unsuitable for permanent infrastructure. The road was built anyway. The Depression-era calculus was blunt. Jobs, access, and the political ambition of opening California's most dramatic coastline to automobile travel outweighed the geological objections of surveyors who understood exactly what kind of ground they were being asked to pave. That decision, made nearly a century ago, is the first entry in a long chain of consequences that has never been fully resolved. The first major modern catastrophe came in May 2017. The Mud Creek landslide deposited approximately 5 million cubic yards of earth across half a mile of Highway 1 south of Gorda, burying the road under 40 feet of debris in a single catastrophic movement. It was the largest coastal landslide in California's modern recorded history. The debris field extended 300 feet into the Pacific Ocean, creating a new peninsula of land where the road had been. Caltrans engineers arriving on scene described it not as a slide, but as an entire hillside that had simply relocated. The repair took 14 months and cost $54 million. What almost no one reported at the time was what Caltrans' own geological assessment concluded after the Mud Creek event. The report acknowledged that the road had been rebuilt on terrain with no reasonable expectation of permanent stability. The recommendation was not inland relocation. The recommendation was that monitoring should be enhanced and repair protocols pre-positioned for future events. The mountain had just buried half a mile of highway under 40 feet of debris, and the official response was essentially to get better at cleaning up next time. The Pfeiffer Canyon Bridge failure earlier that same year had already closed the northern section of Highway 1 for months. Paul's Slide, Rat Creek, the 2021 storm closures, the atmospheric river damage of 2023, each event arriving faster behind the last, each repair more expensive than the one before it, each reopening celebrated as a recovery, while the underlying geology remained exactly as unstable as it had always been. Caltrans's own landslide susceptibility mapping classifies multiple active segments of Highway 1 through the Big Sur corridor as high to very high landslide risk, which are the top two categories in the agency's own assessment framework. The road that California keeps rebuilding sits, by its own documentation, on ground that was never suitable for a permanent road. The mountain has been making that argument for 90 years. The evidence is now becoming very hard to dismiss. When Highway 1 closes, Big Sur does not slow down. It stops. There is no alternate route. There is no parallel road one valley over that absorbs the traffic and keeps commerce moving. There is one road, and when it is gone, everything that depends on it is gone with it. That means that for approximately 1,000 people who live permanently along this coastline, every closure is not a detour. It is a siege. The practical realities accumulate fast. Grocery deliveries stop. Medical appointments become helicopters or nothing. A rancher with a sick animal, a resident with a cardiac event, a family with a newborn and a complication, all of them are now dependent on Coast Guard availability, weather windows, and the logistical goodwill of agencies already stretched by the same storm system that took the road. Mike Suttle, who has run a cattle operation in the Lucia Mountains above Big Sur for over 30 years, has now been cut off by Highway 1 closures 4 separate times. He does not describe it as an inconvenience. He describes it as a slow erasure of the conditions that make staying possible at all. The economic anatomy of the corridor makes the human cost larger than the permanent population alone. Big Sur generates an estimated $400 million in annual tourism revenue, every dollar of it moving along a single 2-lane road. When that road closes, the restaurants, inns, and small operators who survive on seasonal margins do not pause. They bleed. Several businesses along the corridor have now closed permanently following repeated Highway 1 shutdowns, unable to absorb a 3rd or 4th season of interrupted access. But beneath the economics and the logistics is something harder to quantify. Families who have lived on this coastline for generations are making decisions that their grandparents never had to make. Not whether to rebuild after a disaster, but whether rebuilding still makes sense at all. Some of them are looking at the geological maps. Some of them already know that the ground beneath their homes appears on the same inventory as the slope that just took the highway. That knowledge does not leave a person. California has spent more than $500 million repairing Highway 1 through the Big Sur corridor over the past 15 years. That number is not a record of investment in infrastructure. It is a record of repetition, the same slopes, the same failure mechanisms, the same emergency mobilizations, billed to the same state accounts, producing the same temporary result. The road reopens. The geology does not change. The next storm arrives, and the cycle starts again. Caltrans engineers are not unaware of the problem. Internal assessments circulated within the agency in the past 3 years have described the current repair model as fiscally unsustainable over a 20-year horizon. The cost of holding Highway 1 in place against an actively retreating coastline is not a fixed number. It is a compounding one. Each repair leaves the surrounding terrain more disturbed. Each closure triggers fresh movement in adjacent unstable zones. The act of rebuilding the road may itself be accelerating the degradation of the slopes it sits on. The engineering alternative, relocating segments of Highway 1 inland, tunneling through the Santa Lucia Range in the most compromised sections, has been studied, priced, and shelved repeatedly. Current estimates for a comprehensive inland realignment of the most vulnerable Big Sur corridor segments run between $4 and $8 billion, depending on scope. federal infrastructure allocations for the entire California coastal highway system do not approach that figure. The gap between what the geology requires and what the budget permits has never been wider. Environmental opposition adds another layer of constraint. Inland realignment would require cutting through designated wilderness, disrupting habitat corridors that took decades of conservation effort to protect. The communities who need the road and the advocates who protect the land it would cross are not natural allies, and the political space between them is where the decision has stalled, repeatedly, for years. What is emerging quietly from state geological agencies is a conclusion that almost no elected official has been willing to say in public. Some portions of Highway 1 cannot be permanently maintained. The ocean will not negotiate, and the current strategy of perpetual repair is not a solution. It is a delay, one that is becoming more expensive with every storm. The forces dismantling the Big Sur coastline are not operating independently of the broader climate system. They are being driven by it, amplified by two converging trends that climate scientists now describe not as projections, but as present, measurable, accelerating realities. And both of them are pointed directly at the 1,500 landslides already mapped and moving along this coast. The first is precipitation intensity. Atmospheric rivers have always been part of California's winter hydrology. What has changed is their character. The same ocean warming that is loading the atmosphere with record moisture content is compressing California's wet season into shorter, more violent windows, delivering what used to arrive over months and days. For a coastline whose slopes are already saturated and structurally compromised, the difference between a gradual wet season and a series of extreme saturation events is the difference between manageable seepage and the kind of poor water pressure spike that triggers deep-seated landslides within hours. USGS modeling projects that under mid-range climate trajectories, the frequency of extreme atmospheric river sequences hitting the Big Sur corridor will double by 2045. The second force is rising from below. Sea level projections for the California coast now anticipate between 1 and 2 feet of additional rise by 2050 under current emissions trajectories. For cliffs already being undercut by wave action at an accelerating rate, even incremental sea level rise translates directly into faster basal erosion, less geological support for the slopes above, and a coastline that retreats landward faster than any infrastructure built on it can be maintained. USGS hazard modeling estimates that under current climate trajectories, between 200 and 400 of the 1,500 mapped landslides along the Big Sur corridor could enter an active catastrophic failure phase within the next 2 decades. And those are only the slides already on the inventory. The unmapped instability throughout the broader Santa Lucia range remains largely unquantified, meaning the official count of 1,500 almost certainly understates the true scale of what is moving. The cliffs are not waiting for a plan. The data has already written one, and it does not include the road. Stand at the gap where Highway 1 used to be and look down. 40 feet below, the debris from a cliff that existed last week is already being rearranged by the Pacific. The ocean does not pause to acknowledge what it has taken. It simply continues, undercutting the next section of cliff face, loading the next weak layer, preparing the next failure with the same indifference it has applied to this coastline for 10,000 years. The difference now is that the process is faster, and the infrastructure in its path was never built to survive it. California will reopen Highway 1. It always does. Crews will mobilize. Engineers will design a repair. Contractors will pour new asphalt over freshly graded fill, and the ribbon of road will appear whole again for a season or 2 or 5. Politicians will call it resilience. Tourism boards will call it a comeback. And the 1,500 landslides on the geological inventory will continue moving at the rates the satellites are already recording, indifferent to the ribbon cutting. What the data is now describing, plainly, measurably, without ambiguity, is a coastline in the process of making a permanent geological decision. The slopes are not oscillating between stable and unstable. They are ratcheting in one direction. The ocean is not cycling through erosive periods. It is advancing. The atmospheric rivers are not anomalies to be averaged out over a longer climate record. They are the new baseline. And the 1,500 mapped landslides are not a list of future hazards. They are a geological verdict that is already being delivered, section by section, storm by storm, in chunks of California that weigh millions of tons and answer to nothing built by human hands. For the communities clinging to this coastline, for the engineers running the repair calculations, for the geologists watching the displacement data update in real time, the question is no longer whether Highway 1 can be saved. It is how much of what California has built along this cliff is already gone, and how many people are still standing on the part that has not fallen yet.